Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. Vice President Kamala Harris is officially the Democratic nominee for president. Harris took to the stage at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago last night and touched on a wide range of topics, formally accepting the nomination for what she said was on behalf of the people.
And so, on behalf of the people, on behalf of every American, regardless of party, race, gender, or the language your grandmother speaks, on behalf of my mother and everyone who has ever set out on their own unlikely journey, on behalf of Americans like the people I grew up with, people who work hard, chase their dreams, and look out for one another, on behalf of everyone whose story could only be written in the greatest nation on earth, I accept your nomination to be President of the United States of America.
So what's next for the race to the White House, and what were the standout moments at the DNC? Well, my guests tonight are Dr. Niambi Carter, author of American While Black and professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Genesis Holland, a student at J. Sargent Reynolds College in Richmond, Virginia. She's also an advocate for Justice and Joy, an intergenerational gender and racial justice organization. And of course, Dr. Ravi Perry, Howard University political science professor. Thank you all for joining the conversation. It has been a long and interesting week. Let me start with you, Dr. Carter. Let's talk about the address last night. Some of the political pundits criticized her, saying that it was short on details and sometimes, changing or flip-flopping on the issues. What's your assessment overall of her speech?
Well, look, I think it was meant to be a closeout for a high note, right? I think you could feel the energy even watching it. It was like the place was radiating. I think her speech was meant to do that. I think it was also trying to introduce her as, I think, both caring, but also tough. It was supposed to do that. So I agree that it was short on details of policy, but given that the tenor of this felt really like a coronation, like a jubilant event, I understood perhaps why they stayed away from that stuff, because the energy was what they were, I think, really trying to gin up in this convention, not just a party platform.
What do you think, Dr. Perry, about her overall speech? Did she hit the right notes? Was there anything that was missing? Your overall thoughts?
I thought it was big on detail about her biography. I thought it was aspirational, and I thought it addressed some mainstream American concerns as it relates to fighting for the middle class. She mentioned protecting the border and signing the bill that Trump prevented from being signed previously. But I think that it was a short speech, certainly in comparison to what Donald Trump did, which is like three times as long in his acceptance.
92 minutes, exactly.
Right. But I think that now that conventions are meant to do two things: they're meant to nominate candidates, and they're meant to adopt these platforms. So I think it will be important for her to talk more about issues now that the ceremonial kind of pomp and circumstance is done. I would like to see her address poverty more, particularly as a person of color and the middle class, and how people can get to the middle class. And I don't think that message was maybe appropriate for yesterday. But in policy details, I think that I'm hoping that we will hear more of that. I know she's a big supporter of workers' rights, big supporter of unions, um, but the working class and the poor are two different populations as well.
Genesis, I know you're chomping at the bit. Your thoughts last night.
Well, I would love to chime in first of all with someone as someone who went to the DNC. I definitely couldn't have taken a 92-minute speech. So there was some convenience in that aspect. But I always speak, and when I come into these spaces, I speak not only for myself, but I feel like for young voters sometimes. And that lack of policy information is hypercritical to us right now, especially as somebody who has this nouveau term that I like to call undecided, in the way that I would never vote for Trump. However, I need some key encouragement in some of Kamala's policies before I can firmly go that way either. So this was really, and I think as others mentioned, the DNC, it was so energetic. It was so high energy. And, you know, as somebody who's thinking from like a political platform, of course, you want to show that strength within your party, right? But at another standpoint, for those who know about the deep schisms that are happening within the community, it comes off a little false. So I think some real policy play would have helped to strengthen and confront some of these issues.
Let's talk a little bit about the historic aspect of this, Dr. Carter. Obviously, last night was a super big deal. First woman of color, first Black woman, first woman. There were women wearing white to honor women's suffrage, but the vice president did not wear white. She really did not acknowledge the historic importance of it. I mean, she did mention HBCU, you know, shout out to Howard University, but she didn't even mention Howard by name. And so do you think that was by design? Some pundits have said it is not for her to raise these issues, it's for her to focus on the work. What do you think?
Well, listen, I mean, nothing is said by accident on that stage. I mean, these speeches are heavily vetted. They've been written. I don't believe she took any liberties with the wording on that. And I think part of it is trying to make this claim. I mean, this is the hard thing about presidential politics, is we are very clear that she's a Black woman, a South Asian woman, right, of the first HBCU graduate, right, to accept a major party nomination. All of those historic firsts on that stage. But she has to appeal to everyone. And unfortunately, that means sometimes people think they have to not walk back. I think that's not the right term, but have to downplay perhaps some of those identities. And I think mentioning Howard University would be great, right? For people like us who value those spaces, who know what those spaces mean, who know how formative they are to who she is as a politician, who she is as a woman, and a person now. I think that would have been a strong signal to Black women, even if she wore a little pink or green. I think that could have been important. But I also think we have to be very clear. This country does not treat women politicians well. I think her choice not to wear white was perhaps about some of that, even as we are on the cusp, right, at that historic anniversary of the 19th Amendment. But, you know, she wore a dark suit, which I think in some respects people treat as like, that's serious, right? Like that's a serious color. That's a person who means business. And we tear women apart as politicians, particularly Black women, everything from their hair to how they dress, their weight, how they look, everything. And so I think her choosing a darker color, a more subdued outfit than she had on the first night, right? Which was, she wore that coconut brown suit, which I'm sure was a joke, you know, a play on that meme. She chose darker colors, pinstripe, you know, the bow, all of those things. I think so there were sort of some nods to that, but we also have to remember the suffragette movement did not include Black women. It took our labor, right? But it did not want us to be a part of it in a real way. I mean, there have been lots of Black women at that time who wrote about the discrimination of white suffragettes. So I don't know if that was a nod to them. But I do think she is trying to appeal to those voters in Arizona, in Pennsylvania, right? In Michigan, who are still cramming to understand how they're going to pick this brown lady to be their president. And I think that was part of the task last night, to appeal to those people, because they, for very different reasons, are undecided, and don't see women as viable leaders. So I think that's why she chose to downplay some of those things that have endeared her, quite frankly, to large swaths of communities.
What do you think, Genesis?
Oh, you saw me over here nodding ferociously, huh?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're watching you. Yeah.
I think, politicians and politics all come down to this mixture of humanization and infallibility. You want someone who seems intimate, like they could be there with you, like they'll actually be able to understand. But at the same time, you don't want them to carry those real human flaws. So that's one aspect, trying to make sure she has, like previously mentioned, this strength, but also this cool ease about her. And they've been very and by that I mean the Democratic Party as a whole, very focused on pushing that narrative, trying to place the right advertisements with the right people. Because also, like mentioned, this idea of a Black woman becoming president is a hard pill to swallow with a lot of people. And some people even have these internal biases that they don't even realize they have until they're confronted with options like this. So it is quite interesting to see the balance in dynamics, having to, and at the same time, when we talk about her, trying to rep and trying to represent, she got reamed out from Trump for going to a sorority event. So things like that, it's like you want to be specific and not isolate. But at the same time, when we focus on who we're trying to pitch to, it isolates another group. And that's just a part of presidency as a whole, though. So
I wanted to ask you, and I'll start with Ravi about this, because I think there was a really important moment last night, and we may have to take a break and continue the conversation on the other side. But even when we look at this conversation with the four of us, I'm the only one with a boring name. Okay, we've got Genesis. We've got Niambi, we've got Ravi. All three of you have these wonderfully musical names. That's the only way that I can describe it. And we saw, Kerry Washington last night with her grandnieces talking about how to pronounce Kamala, comma and then la, like la 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 la. Ravi, but that was also an important moment. I'll let you have this last minute, and we'll take a break and we'll continue the conversation. Your thoughts about that moment.
Well, one thing that the vice president and I share is that we both have names that are originally Sanskrit, or Southeast Asian, Indian, or Sri Lankan.
Excuse me, teach the people, please. Teach the people.
Yeah,
Go right ahead.
So my name Ravi, for example, means sun in Sanskrit, and I'm not exactly sure what Kamala means, that, along with our long history of racial language in our country, the right of our own ability as African descendants of those who were enslaved, to not even really know our biological native country, family origin last names. I think that the fact that it's important that we constantly reinforce the correct spelling and the correct pronunciation of her name is because it's so easy for people to disrespect not only her, but in doing so, I would argue kind of all people with funny names, as Barack Obama said on the stage, but also kind of the whole history of American and African American and American Indian and Southeast Asian and Asian Pacific Islander and so many others of course, Latina experience that is the American story. And the names that come with that, sorry, Harold, I guess you got skipped over, is, part of the American story that I think her message resonates with, that we're going forward, we're not going back.
I let you guys continue with this really important point in just a bit. We're going to take a break. Don't forget, you can hear this in every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The original Quiet Storm is next on WHUR. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue this conversation about the DNC on Sirius XM Channel 141 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM Channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our Democratic National Convention coverage. We are asking today, what's next for the race to the White House? And what are the standout moments from the DNC last night? Of course, we continue with our guest, Dr. Niambi Carter, author of American While Black and professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Genesis Holland, a student at J. Sargent Reynolds College in Richmond, Virginia. She is also an advocate for Justice and Joy, an intergenerational gender and racial justice organization. And Dr. Ravi Perry, Harvard University political science professor. Before the break, we were talking about that moment with actor Kerry Washington and the grandnieces of Kamala Harris, and it was a cute moment. There's no question about it, but it was an important moment. Genesis, your thoughts about it and the importance of it.
Yeah, there were a lot of, especially in this last phase of, presentations, a lot of cute moments with weighted tactics, and this one kind of directly confronted microaggressions that you might notice. Historically, mispronunciation and minimization of Black names or, otherwise ethnic names has been used as a way to kind of dumb down a person, to limit them, to, cause confusion and kind of stake back some of their own authority. We don't kind of understand why it happens, but we do understand the strength in the name. So this was a really important moment because it's helping people to remember her name. If this is going to be the first female president, the first woman president, the first Black president, the first South Asian president, then you must remember her name.
Dr. Carter?
No, and I would say, as somebody with one of those names, right, when people would rather mispronounce your name or just say, oh, you know what I mean, or what, do you have a nickname? No, I do not. You can say Niambi, like you got a knee, a and a B, right? Like you have to do that over and over again. And I think Genesis is exactly right, which is this desire to twist our names and to say, these names that in many cases our parents were very thoughtful about. I think there's a lot of ways that people like to antagonize Black people about their names or our naming conventions. Like, oh, that name doesn't mean anything, right? Ravi is no more or less special than Taquan just because it doesn't have a quote meaning. But the important thing is people who love us gave us these names and thought they were doing something special and impactful for us. Our uniqueness, right? Showing the world that my child is one of a kind. Right? My child is special. They have a name that not everybody else has, right? That is something that is to be celebrated. I think often we are derided for our names. And I think Kamala means lotus, if I'm not mistaken. But either way, these names, and people need to get used to them because America doesn't look like it used to look, right? I mean, my name is a product of the 70s. Roots came out and my mom was like, this child will have a name that is of African origin, right? That was important to her as she was thinking of, and my father, as they were thinking about the person they wanted me to be and how they wanted me to feel about myself. So people need to get together and figure out how to do basic human things like, I'm sorry, how do you pronounce your name properly? Please help me. How many times have someone, I recently had someone call me from a TV station say, hey, can you send me a recording of how you say your name properly?
Wow, nice.
Those things are important and they're small, but they are so big because there are other little girls that are named Kamala and Barack and, whatever names, right? Olayemi, right? Like all of these beautiful names. And the least we can do, the most basic respect we can give someone is to call them by their name and their pronoun.
One of the things when this issue started coming up and when Donald Trump was pronouncing her name, I was reminded, and here's my teach the people moment. Some let me drop this knowledge, and certainly none of us in this conversation are old enough to remember this. Genesis, this is perfect for you. You could look it up. But back in 1967, when Muhammad Ali was fighting Ernie Terrell, and this was around the time that he was transitioning from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali. And during the entire fight, including beating Ernie Terrell to a pulp, but every time he threw a punch, he would say, "What's my name? What's my name?" And certainly, that's one of those historic moments where it just doesn't get much blacker than that, And I was waiting for Kamala Harris to drop a "What's my name" moment last night. I was slightly disappointed by that, but But here's something else, and this is also a really critical moment in her speech last night.
This election is not only the most important of our lives, it is one of the most important in the life of our nation. In many ways, Donald Trump is an unserious man. But the consequences of putting Donald Trump back in the White House are extremely serious.
Well, there you go. So, Genesis, I'm going to start with you as a very young, but also a very serious person. What did you think when you heard that?
I mean, I think it's always great to directly confront your enemies and opponents in this kind of space. It's time for you. If you feel about it, say it, But it is interesting. And I think this, goes to the DNC as a whole, this idea of what an undecided voter is anymore. In historical context, it would be like Trump or Kamala. And as I mentioned previously, sometimes there are people who are kind of in between. And the last campaign, Biden versus Trump, the whole idea was, let's just defeat Trump. Let's just defeat Trump. And this, as a marketing, perspective, does still work for some, but for some, they also don't find it to be enough. We get that we don't like Donald Trump, but what else? And so that's kind of the interesting dynamic. I both love it, and at the same time, it's like, and again, mentioned this earlier, want for more.
Ravi, I just love the vocabulary because, I love words, and the use of the term unserious man is not something that you hear in the town square. That's one of the things that my stepmother, my refined Southern Belle stepmother from Lynchburg, Virginia, would have said in a very softly critical voice, that this is an unserious man. That the intellectuality of that part of the speech really, for me, drove it home.
Well, I agree. I think it was a beauty in a way. My mom was an English teacher for 40-something years, so I also love words, and I think just as Dr. Carter was saying, all of this is deliberate, all of this is written in advance, seen by multiple hands, and I think that keeping that in is important. So we're told when writing speeches to really write at a sixth grade level, and that not that the American education standard isn't higher, but that when you're trying to communicate particularly high level amounts of information, you need to use simple language and words that people understand. And people know what it means to be serious and what it means to not be serious. And which is why she did not need to explain what she meant by an unserious man. And instead, she just immediately went to the juxtaposition of an unserious man who, in the face of serious calamities, folded under pressure.
Yeah, Niambi.
Absolutely. And I think also unserious is just part of our lexicon now. When we talk about people being unserious, I think that was also a signal to Black people, to younger people who use that term regularly for all kinds of things. So it is not only undercut, but it is also a message. I mean, of course, I think the people who are most politically astute are the people who pick that up, right? Like Genesis, who's like, oh, she called him unserious. She gets it, right? But I think it's also important because Robbie said something that was really key here. We saw this man who actually had an opportunity to save lives. And what he did was use it as an opportunity to score political points. And this is not to suggest that there are no critiques to be had of Democrats. I think there are plenty. But in terms of this moment, right, could have been his defining moment. I hate to say it. It could have been almost like September 11th was for George W. Bush, right? It's a tragedy, but at the same time, he was able to gin up a lot of goodwill and really use that to catapult him to a second term.
And unite the country in a lot of ways.
Unite the country. In the same way, we have a pandemic, right, that is not caring about where you live. It's not caring about your party ID. Now, it does care if you're a first responder, Black, overweight, elderly, all the things, right, that many of our communities have. But he had a moment to be presidential and tell people, wear your darn masks, even in Mississippi, even in Arkansas. Shut it down for a minute so that we can do something. Because very shortly, we all, because capitalism is going to figure out a way to make its money, adjust it to how we do business. Stand 6 feet apart, wear a mask, control the traffic up and down aisles. Maybe instead of being sit in, you just get your things to go. All of that was figured out in pretty short order. But instead, he told people, do what you want. It doesn't matter. On public conveyances and other things, he was saying to people, you shouldn't have to do this, suggesting to people that the scientists that were working around the clock all around the world were sort of in cahoots to give people a vaccine that was unsafe. And again, I'm not saying that people shouldn't be skeptical or whatever, but this was one time that the entire world was doing the same thing at the same time and worked really quickly. And you undermined your own government, your own officials, not just Dr. Fauci, but everyone who was a part of this project. And you made them unsafe, right? Because people were getting all kinds of nasty messages, threats, all kinds of things. You made us less safe because, I mean, people are wearing masks, but some people aren't. I mean, the guidance was pretty straightforward and simple. We've had pandemics before, but this man was so busy sowing fear and misinformation that we had a lot of people end up being sick for prolonged periods of time and or losing their lives in some cases. It didn't have to happen that way. It's not to say that there would have been zero casualties, but this would have been handled much better. And had we had someone with a little bit more maturity who understood governance and understood the importance of leadership, we might have had very different outcomes than what we saw. And unfortunately, we can't rewind the clock and we won't ever know what could have been. We know what is, though.
Yeah.
And here we are.
I want to go back to Kamala Harris in a bit, but next I really want to talk about some of the other moments last night. And one of the earlier moments before she spoke was this one.
45 wanted us unalive. He wanted us dead. Today we are exonerated because the actual perpetrator confessed and DNA proved it. That guy says he still stands by the original guilty verdict. He dismisses the scientific evidence rather than admit he was wrong. He has never changed, and he never will.
Yusef Salaam from the exonerated Central Park Five. It almost Dr. Perry needs no commentary. I will say that it was, on one hand, from my perspective, you could see in Salam a reminder of magnificent Blackness. On the other hand, it was very painful to watch. I would think a lot of Black people had a very visceral, emotional, response in remembering how we got to this point. Your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tragedy, of course, that did not have to happen. And if you are a Black man in America, it's in many ways an experience all too familiar. Um, some of us just, didn't necessarily, find Donald Trump in our crosshairs. This was, I think, another example of the DNC doing well with putting up different kinds of voices. They were criticized for not having like an explicit Palestinian voice, but they did have Arab American voices. They did have even, of course, our frat brother Harold, a House potentially House Minority Leader, but potentially House Speaker, Hakeem Jeffries,
Mm-hmm.
referencing Donald Trump, his bro and breaking up a relationship. I think this is a really great example of the party pitching to Black men, knowing that Black men are probably the subgroup of the most largest concern in this campaign, as the Trump campaign has done a very effective job at outreaching to Black men with celebrity and gold shoes and hip hop influences, and the lie that he is the one that wrote them checks that they got, via the stimulus, that $600 or whatever, and these PPP loans that half the people are in jail for now. But the reality is that that has worked. We are still duped. In 2016, we saw the bipartisan Senate report that said that Russia, deliberately influenced our African American households in particular, and it had a huge influence, I think, on African American men in depressing the turnout either for Hillary Clinton or getting them to vote for a third party or for Donald Trump. And we've seen that Donald Trump actually increased his support among Black men over his two election efforts. And so that is, I think, was a tragedy. It's a sad story for all of us who know that full story. But, to see, Salim now a councilman, in Harlem, I think it's a redemption story as well, that even when you might have a big, bad bully in Donald Trump who would take out a full page ad in the New York Times to threaten your existence and to double down on it even after evidence, unequivocal evidence, proves their innocence, shows that he is careless with the lives of African Americans. And I hope, and particularly Black men, and I hope that despite the work that he did purportedly with the crime bill during the Trump administration, that African American men see the message of the exonerated five and hear their story for what it was.
Genesis.
Oh my gosh, there was so much to listen there. The first thing I want to say is I could talk all day about how I think DNC did its representation because I was there. So that's a very multi-layered issue. But I will say I saw the speech. I was on an airplane. It was kind of delayed and I was watching it through one headphone. And I remember before I could even hear him speak, I said, that was an amazing choice to have on stage.
Mm-hmm.
Having him there and he is one of the main examples in Central Park 5 in general, is one of the main reasons or things that I use when confronting Black men who are voting for Trump. Because I think easily sometimes you can get persuaded by the misinformation campaign that is Donald Trump. He changes his answers every 5 seconds, and sometimes he sounds so believable and so firm in a lie he just told that, from a casual viewing standpoint, you might get persuaded. So one of the examples I bring up, because people try to say, oh, Trump did so much for Black people, he's not even a bad choice. He originally was Democratic. And I say, well, what about Central Park 5? And time again, that example always shuts them down. So to have him on stage, I was like, so they are listening. They are listening to some of the key points that we have against him to, kind of not persuade, but remind viewers and remind voters of why they're voting the way they are. Um, and again, I have many multi-layered issues about the DNC representation, but I will say in that regard, in that aspect, I did think that was a great choice, and I wouldn't have done it any other way.
Dr. Carter.
Yeah, I mean, look, anytime you see these men now, but who are boys, I think it always gets you in the gut. And I think it is important not just to remember what Donald Trump did to them specifically, but how he has treated Black people historically. Because while he did put that ad in the paper calling for their execution of the Central Park Five, he also discriminated against Black people who were renters. We know he has not paid. There were multiple episodes of him not paying people who work for him, many of them people of color. So, I mean, Donald Trump has a very sordid history if you look through New York. I mean, not to mention, he's still got charges pending. So I think it was an important moment to remind people of the real human cost of a Donald Trump, because even though he wasn't in political office at the time, he was of significant presence in that city. And I think now seeing these men, right, the Yusef Salams, the Corey Wise, the Kevin Richardsons, all of them there, I think is a very important reminder. And I think the language that Dr. Perry used a moment ago about a bully, right, and seeing these people not only live, but start to recoup their lives in very particular ways. They can never get back the time that was stolen from them. But to then be on that stage, and I think it's also important that, when we are talking to Black men, right, that we don't just talk about policy and stimulus checks. I mean, that's part of it. Policy is something, but there is a humanity and a human aspect in seeing these young men and men like them that I think is also important when you're trying to not convince, maybe persuade, bring people over, make people reconsider. Maybe that's a better term. Their desire to support Donald Trump. So I think I will use Genesis' trick of talking about the Central Park Five, but we have to remind people that Donald Trump is not a friend of Black communities. He's willing to use Black people to get what he wants, but he is not a friend of our communities, not historically and not currently. And I think his wanton desire to take away things that Black people actually do value, like Medicare, right? Like Social Security, like the Affordable Care Act, with the now Obamacare, right? They don't call it that anymore. The Affordable Care Act, right? Things Black people actually do like. And I also tell people this, let's also remember, we are not rich enough for Donald Trump, right? Like, people like, he's going to give us taxes. We're going to have more money in our pocket. We are not rich enough. We are not in the tax bracket where those Trump tax cuts are actually going to really affect our lives. So I also want people to remember that it is not us that he is talking to. I know it's aspirational, but it is not us.
Speaking of reconsidering, listen to this, and I want Genesis to respond first and tell me your thoughts about this.
I mean, if you told me the 15-year-old me would be on stage supporting a prosecutor and a teacher, there is no way that I would have believed you. But because of that, I made assumptions about Kamala's record. And I often repeated them to a lot of people. I believe that your apology should be as loud as your accusation, and I'm here apologizing in front of the whole damn world. I was wrong, and I'm so very glad I was wrong, because Kamala, you give me hope for the future, a future where my grandchildren, Nola and Stevie, had the freedom to control their own bodies, where they have the opportunity to go as far as their wits and their talents would take them. That future, ladies and gentlemen, is possible, but only if we elect Kamala Harris as the 47th President of the United States of America.
Genesis, what did you think about that apology?
I find it very interesting because whenever I bring up, my hesitation for Kamala Harris, I never mention her policies because from a policy standpoint or from a previous policy standpoint, I don't think I have enough education on her as a prosecutor. So when people bring that up as a thing, I always try to stay in conversations I'm educated about or learn. So when I just like to bring up the now, right? So one of the main reasons why we transitioned from Biden to Harris was this idea that Biden had become A, too old and handled B, the situation in Gaza, the tragedy in Gaza, very incorrectly for young voters. And so there was an assumption that Harris would be more attractive. And in some ways, that is correct. We're getting more voters turning out every single day. People went to the DNC, people saw the energy and were persuaded. But in many regards, the DNC was not a convention for undecided voters. It wasn't there to really persuade. It was there to formally, kind of firm up the people who were already in that support bracket. So when I hear that apology, I think it's good to, and I encourage this. I was in the news yesterday too, but I encourage people to always vote when they feel strongly about a candidacy. But I also encourage people to not think that just because you only have binary options that you have to, in a way, settle. There's always room for better. If we're going to humanize Kamala Harris, then we have to acknowledge the fact that she is human with flaws. So go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish real quick because I'm short on time, but go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, but I was just going to say you can't have direct actions and words kind of conflict. So if you're going to be a better option than Biden, then you can't have a standing ovation for him and then expect those two to kind of go together, So it's just about being very clear on narrative and words, and that's what's kind of losing undecided voters.
So my perspective, real quick, and maybe Dr. Perry, I'm a little more holistic about this because it was less about why he apologized to me than the fact that you had a Black man who has a history of saying, I said what I said, but apologizing. And for me, I think that was also another a powerful moment for Black men. Give me your 20 seconds thought about that, Dr. Perry.
Well, I agree and I disagree with Genesis, sadly, on this point. I actually thought this convention did a very good job of reaching out to undecideds. You had Oprah Winfrey mentioning that she was independent. You had several Republicans, several high in the Trump administration, talking about them switching and voting for a Democrat for the first time ever. And I think that it's appropriate for Vice President Harris to have been the choice after Biden. There should not have been any other choice because the system doesn't work that way in terms of how money flows, and because she earned that right as vice president. That's the whole reason why you have a vice president in the event of a presidential calamity or voluntary transition. And so I thought that the DNC did a very good job reaching out to different kinds of voters. They had content creators there for the first time. It really pissed off some traditional journalists. But it was important to reach out to young voters that way. And I think that she has the responsibility, as we all do, I think, of acknowledging the sacrifice that Biden made for any president to sacrifice ambition for another cause is something that is noble and is worthy of admiration.
Dr. Carter, I'll let you have the final word. Where do you believe that this campaign needs to go next? What does she need to do to seal the deal, or what could she do to lose it?
Well, I mean, listen, she's going to have to go to battleground states. I think that's going to happen. She's in spitting distance of Donald Trump in places like Pennsylvania, Arizona, Michigan. They are neck and neck. And those places are going to have to be part of the coalition if she's going to win, because we still have an electoral college, unfortunately, right? She'll win the popular vote, but she could also still lose the presidency. This is going to be about the ground game. She has to get people turned out. And I think, I don't think actually politics is won on policy. I don't think elections are won on policy. I think people who care about policy do. Most people don't. But I do think she's going to have to tell people something more than what we got last night. I think she nodded. I think Robbie's right. Poverty is real. People are still unemployed despite this recovering economy. People are still hurting. So I think there's going to have to be more said there. But she's going to have to get that ground game going, knocking on doors, the whole shebang.
Thank you all so much, Genesis Holland, Dr. Ravi Perry, and Dr. Niambi Carter. Thank you again. I really appreciate your input. That is the Daily Drum for this Friday, August 23rd. For News Director Renee Nash, reporters Millette Green and Bramante Bryant, I'm Harold Fisher. Good night and have a wonderful weekend.